We've looked at some of the geographical realities of the Middle East and the geographical realities in which the Tanakh is written. We've looked at desert, we've looked at rivers and water, we've looked at the mountains, and then we've looked at the fauna and flora, the plant life and the animal life. All of those are vitally important to be able to understand the Tanakh, particularly to understand some of the things in Torah and in the prophecy, because the prophecy uses, as much as Torah does, use symbols in order to explain theological truth. And so you need to have a sense of that, but also you need to have a sense of the environment, the context in which the Israelites came into Canaan. The first thing that I want to talk about, particularly about that, is about tribalism. And we need to understand that in fact the Jews themselves, or at least the Israelites themselves, were tribal people. When they came into the promised land under Joshua, it would make you feel that they were a nation already under God, that they were this nation and that they were already connected to each other and that they were one people. But that would be wrong to understand that. And we can see that particularly if you look at the book of Judges, where in the book of Judges you realize very quickly that each tribal group really had their own piece of land and looked after themselves. Sometimes better than others, but effectively they were more of a loose group of tribes, loosely bound around their own chiefs, around their own tribal leaders. And so, of course, we have the 13 tribes of Israel. Sometimes we have an issue with this because the Bible often only talks about 12 tribes. And of course, there were only 12 tribes who had land. So only 12 tribes were given land in the promised land. The 13th tribe, which of course is the tribe of Levi, wasn't given land. Rather, what they were spread out across the whole loose confederacy of tribes, and they were, in a sense, the religious heart of each tribe. And that continues to be the case until the foundation of the temple in Jerusalem in the time of Solomon, when in fact now the movement of the religion moves out of the individual tribes and moves to the centralized location of the temple. But what we need to see is that not only were Israel made up of 13 tribes or of different tribes, but so were the people around them. That in fact at this stage we can't talk about nation states as we have today. In fact, what we have in the time of Abraham, as we have in the time later on even of David, is we have surrounded by these other smaller tribes. Many of them also centered around a particular patriarch or father. So, for example, we have the father of the Edomites, who is Esau. And we have the father of the Moabites, which is, of course, Lot's son. We've got the Ammonites, which again is one of Lot's sons from his own daughters. And so what we realize there is that we have small groups of people. Remember, the earth is very unpopulated at the time. And so we've got these small groups of people taking over a particular piece of land and using the land to their particular benefit. It's only much later, it's only in the 12th century BCE that we begin to see the formation of empires. And the first major empire to come into this area, other than the Egyptians, because the Egyptians had been around for some time as an empire, but the first empire that begins to affect this whole area is the Assyrians. And so the Assyrians moved beyond just being a tribal group and moved towards being an empire which encompasses a number of different tribes. And so what we see is that tribalism really is the focus here. And right through until the end of the book of Judges in the Tanakh, that's the reality for the Israelites as well. They are not one people. They are really a group of people all under their own particular tribal heads. It's only when they begin to demand a king in the book of Samuel that we begin to see this collective call for saying we want to move beyond just our tribalism to actually becoming a nation of people. Now, Saul doesn't really achieve that. It's really the next king, King David, that finally achieves the ability to draw together all those 13 tribes into one whole and create what we would call the nation of Israel. Of course, that nation of Israel was only to survive his life and his son Solomon's, but that was to break up after that under the heading of Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And so we see that in fact the time of Israel being one nation is actually a very short-lived one. And in fact for the Middle East itself, once the empires begin, they really continue and begin to absorb many of the tribal groups into these big empires. It's the wonder of the people of Israel that even though they had been going through so many empires conquered that piece of land, that they didn't give up their identity and their cultural heritage, but maintained it as people of Judah, which of course we now understand as the people who we call the Jews, the ancestors, or the successors rather, to the people of Judah. And so what we have is tribalism. And they came into an environment which had tribes, which those tribes were often polytheist or animist. Many of those tribes had their own particular ways of doing things, and many of the tribes of Israel began to learn from them. And that's where we can see, for example, the intermarriage between some of the Jew or the Israelites and the other tribes around them. For example, King Ahab marries a Phoenician from what we would call today Lebanon. We know her as Queen Jezebel. And of course, not only does he marry her, but then she brings with her some of her particular religious devotion. And of course, we see the effects of that in the stories of Elijah and Elisha. It's in that concept that we need to see that Israel, therefore, is tribes among many different people groups. And so what makes the Israelites stand out amongst those tribes is some of the things that are their distinctives, which we read or learned about in Module 2.